I'm Mark Golub, and as the election primaries continue to unfold with twists and surprises seemingly at every turn, how is it all being seen from the Israeli perspective? And so to give us some idea, we're pleased to be joined from Jerusalem by Abbey, who in addition to serving as the Media and Internet Director for the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, happens to be an American Jew with quite a bit of first-hand experience with American politics, having served for 30 years in journalism in the U.S. and Israel. Alan is the founder of Ynet News, the English language website of Yediot Achronot, and also served as the executive vice president of the Jerusalem Post and as editor-in-chief of jpost.com. And in the 1980s, Alan was a reporter for Vermont's Burlington Press and actually covered Bernie Sanders' successful bid to become mayor of Burlington, which of course launched Bernie Sanders' political career in 1981. And Alan, thank you so much for joining us on JBS.
It's my pleasure, Mark, as always.
Alan, before I ask you some specific questions regarding the American primary elections, as I do with anyone who offers commentary on our Election 2016 series, can you tell us where you stand politically? The Shalom Hartman Institute and Daniel Hartman are understood to be left-leaning on issues relating to the state of Israel. When you were in America, were you a typical liberal American Jew whose loyalties were to the Democratic Party?
Mark, of course, every party has personal biases. When I was trained in journalism, we were trained to filter those out as much as possible and to report what we called objective journalism, which was to get the facts as we understood them and put them together in a fair and balanced way. Now, things have in fact changed, and I think you get the essential differences in today's journalism very correct. But I would also want to tell you that I've been involved in researching and studying and working in the field of journalism ethics with a number of organizations. And one of the things that I've actually changed my feeling on is that bias is something that is in some ways not correct. It's not worth ignoring. It's not worth denying. Everybody has bias. Mm-hmm. What I think is more important, however, is whether the journalists and the organizations that employ them are honest about their policies and their politics and are transparent and clear with the people that they that in their audience. So if to me, in some senses, it's okay if Fox is a right-wing news organization. I'm not necessarily saying it is, but it's okay as long as they let us know where they are. And then, as you said, I can start filtering my understanding, my belief, my following of their work through the lens that they've provided to me, through the honesty that they've communicated to me in their journalism.
Okay. I think you say it beautifully, Alan. And then, so I ask you only one more time. Should we know your leaning and your bias, whatever it is, before we hear your analysis?
Fair question, Mark. In Israel, since I've lived here for the last 16 years, I've voted for several different political parties. I'm not a member of any Israeli political party. I would say that I don't put myself in any of the camps that people like to put themselves in. And I like to feel that I let the facts determine my positions rather than be in an ideology that tries to force the positions in the facts into the ideas that I want them to be.
But it's interesting to me, you gave me a political answer in terms of Israeli politics. What I was really looking for was whether, even though you're now in Israel, you've made Aliyah, you're doing fabulous work. You know, I have the highest regard for you and for the Shalom Institute, Shalom Hartman Institute, and I'm thrilled with the partnership and that we show so much of what you're doing on JBS to the American people and to the American Jewish community. But what I was asking for is, even though you are now an Israeli, when you look at American politics, which I'm going to ask you to comment on, mm-hmm. do you bring a Democratic or Republican filter to your own view?
Okay, you're really putting me on the spot here. Mark, I generally voted. Let me tell you, I'll tell you one final thing about my own personal politics. I grew up in New York City and in Brooklyn. And in Brooklyn, there was really only one political party, which was the Democratic Party, right. Except in my era, when there was another political party that my family, my father, and many people I knew voted for, that I associated myself with actually in my earliest days, and that was the Liberal Party, which I don't believe exists anymore. So if I had to put myself in a political camp, it would probably be somewhere in the old late 20th century New York City Liberal Party.
Okay, Alan, you've been aware of, if not watching, Bernie Sanders for some 35 years. It's somewhat striking that very little has been made of Bernie Sanders being Jewish. When he first announced his candidacy for the Democratic presidential nomination last May, there were some who talked about his Jewish background, referenced the fact that he worked on a kibbutz in Israel for a time. There was even speculation that he had Israeli citizenship, and the specter of Jewish dual loyalty was raised. But during his battle with Hillary Clinton, the media never seems to mention his Jewishness. From your perspective, as a journalist who was working in America and as an Israeli now, any idea what this means, that there's no reference to Bernie Sanders being Jewish?
Mark, I always hate to disagree with you, but I think I will on this point. I think there actually has been a lot recently, particularly as the campaign has progressed, about Bernie as what he represents, what his beliefs, what his philosophy is. There have been articles in many of the mainstream papers. And what we found, to me, I think, actually, that the recent series of articles talking about, Bernie being Jewish and that not being an issue in the campaign, and in some ways on a very overt level, it really hasn't been an issue. But I think the fact that all of a sudden there are a raft of stories talking about Bernie being Jewish, and his presence on Saturday Night Live, and his playing up the thick Brooklyn accent with the Larry David and all of that activity, it is in fact bringing to the fore that Bernie is a cultural American Jew from New York, from the mid and late 20th century, an assimilated, liberal, socially liberal New York Jew. And I think that, in fact, is coming into play in the campaign. There have been, unfortunately, some hints about this in certain code words that people have used, something that Bernie and I, in fact, saw many, many years ago in Burlington, Vermont, where the word overt anti-Semitism isn't in play, but kind of covert, under the table, quiet, coded, wink and a nod, anti-Semitism may very well come into play. And in fact, in sharp contrast to what a lot of American newspapers have said, that Bernie's being Jewish doesn't matter, a very perceptive article ran in Haaretz about a week ago by Chemi Shalev, the U.S. correspondent of Haaretz, who took the exact opposite position. Now, maybe because he is Israeli and now I'm Israeli, we have a radar to the more sensitive. Maybe we're paranoid. I don't know. Maybe we're too sensitive. But I believe, and unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, I believe that as this campaign continues and as Bernie continues in his quest for the presidency, there will be a little bit more of that, however coded and covert it is.
Okay, first of all, I never mind you disagreeing with me. I appreciate it. I want to push you. The Saturday Night Live skits that included Bernie Sanders certainly did not suggest anything negative about him. There was nothing in my mind that was a hint that anything connected to SNL had an anti-Semitic bias. And I don't know what Chemi Shalev is referring to. And when you say to me there are articles being written, I haven't seen them. I'm watching American television all the time, every single channel. On CNN, I haven't heard it. On MSNBC, I haven't heard it. On Fox, I haven't heard it. I haven't heard it on the networks. So if I'm wrong, I need you to specify where you have seen some kind of subtle anti-Semitic suggestions that Bernie Sanders may have dual loyalties or that his Jewishness is an issue. It seems to me different even from the candidacy of Senator Lieberman, Joe Lieberman, when he was a vice presidential candidate recently. But I don't see it myself. If I'm wrong, tell me where you've seen it, where Chemi Shalev has seen it, so that all of us can be more aware of it.
Let me tell you a little story about Bernie and me from 1981 in Burlington, Vermont. And one of the things I want to make a point of saying is that the Vermont that you may have in your mind today is not the Vermont of 1981 when Bernie Sanders first ran for mayor. And Bernie announced his candidacy in a very quiet way, and he was given no serious chance of getting anywhere close to the mayoral seat of the city of Vermont and city of Burlington. And that's something you may have heard echoes of in the last year from the mainstream media in the United States. And as I traveled the campaign trail with Bernie, and not that I traveled very far. Burlington's a small city. I walked the streets of Burlington with him, and I watched him as he knocked on doors. And I watched him connect with individuals and people in parts of the city that the city fathers had ignored for years. I saw the connection he made with people, and I saw that he was actually gaining support and strength, and that he was able, with a few friends and colleagues, to put together a unique, for that time, coalition that he is in fact replicated on a statewide basis in Vermont, and is in fact replicating today on the national scale, which is young people, students, working class people, blue collar people, union members, academics, intellectuals, a kind of somewhat of a rebuilding of the original FDR Democratic coalition. And as Bernie kept building this coalition in Burlington in the dead of winter in early 1981, January and February, and he started getting closer, something happened with the city of Burlington. So I was reporting on these stories for the Burlington Free Press. I was the first person to write in depth and take him articles and take him seriously. And then one day, about 2 weeks before the election, an anonymous, mimeographed, childishly drawn newsletter flyer was circulated throughout City Hall, the cafes and diners of downtown Burlington, called the Burlington Flea Press, a very crude satire on the name of my newspaper at that time, the Burlington Free Press. And what it said in its short little publication was that Bernie Sanders was from New York. Bernie Sanders was from Brooklyn. Bernie Sanders went to Madison High School in Brooklyn, and that Alan Abbey was from New York. Alan Abbey was from Brooklyn, and Alan Abbey's parents went to high school with Bernie Sanders. And then and now, I'm sorry to say, and maybe you can call me paranoid or whatever, but and I've seen it repeated other times in American politics, New York, and I put that in quotes, New York is code that everybody knows, the same way Lenny Bruce many, many years ago said that if you're from New York, you're Jewish no matter whether you're Puerto Rican, Italian, or African American. And if you're from Montana, even if you're Jewish, you're not Jewish. And so New York always means Jew to the outside world, that is the world outside the city of New York. And when in the Republican debates where Ted Cruz has said, even Donald Trump has New York values. And then in a recent follow-up comment, he talked about that again and used the word chutzpah in it again to emphasize that the Jewish subtext that is coming out. Now, it's come out at the moment overtly to a very small degree on the Republican side. I don't think that, however vituperative Hillary Clinton's criticism has become of Bernie at this point, there's any hint of that on the Democratic side. Certainly not. But unfortunately, and again, you can say that living in Israel and feeling the tension and the stress, the strain of the Jewish nationality has gotten to me. But I worry, put it this way, I'm not sure of this, but I do worry that there will be a subtle strain of latent anti-Semitism in the American populace that will come out at times, especially as Bernie seems to be getting closer and closer, at the very least, to being the front runner. And if the results at the end of today prove to be what the pollsters say, then I think you may very well call Bernie Sanders the front runner, and that you have a Brooklyn, grumpy Jewish Brooklyn guy running for the president of the United States. I think something's going to come of that.
Okay, we will see. By the way, we are taping this with Alan on the day that the New Hampshire primary is taking place. That's what that reference is to. Are you saying that you believe from Israel that you think Bernie Sanders has a legitimate chance to become the Democratic nominee for president?
I would say that anybody who says he has no chance is going to be wrong. And that what I've seen in my career in journalism, political journalism, both in Israel and in the United States, is that I have one saying about political journalism. That is that the conventional wisdom is always wrong. And if the conventional wisdom were right, Edmund Muskie would have been a president of the United States, and many other people who have come and gone would have been president of the United States, let alone many other things in the political arena. And when a year and a half ago, reporters at the Washington Post and the New York Times, as they wrote their first snickering stories about Bernie's fly-by-night campaign, when he made his Washington-based announcement on the steps of the Capitol and could barely get the journalists to spend 3 minutes to listen to him, because of course he was a whack job who wasn't going to go anywhere. Then I said then, and I say to this day, that don't underestimate Bernie Sanders. I'm not endorsing him. I'm not saying I'm in his campaign. In fact, one thing I will tell you, that as a political reporter, the times I dealt with Bernie, he never warmed up to me. The irony of that scurrilous campaign against me in Vermont 35 years ago, the irony was that Bernie didn't like me at all. Whatever I wrote, Bernie thought I was still a tool of the corporate media and that I was in the pocket of the Gannett Corporation, which owned the Burlington Free Press. So I'm not saying this as a supporter or personal friend of Bernie Sanders. What I am saying is that he has an ability to connect with people in a very deep way, and that he is reaching them at with both their frustration and anger, and at the same time in an aspirational way, to bring out the best in them, to hope for the best, that they can have more than they have now in a very large and frustrated middle and lower middle class in the United States. And I think on the dark side, as it were, the flip side of that coin, Donald Trump is reaching very much the same feelings of disenfranchisement that the other guys, the big guys, the rich guys, whatever, are running things, and that the average Joe and Jane, has no chance to improve their lives anymore. And while Donald Trump appeals sometimes to the dark underbelly of the American psyche, I think and I hope, as Bernie appeals to a higher level and a more hopeful aspirational side. And therefore, I don't think that he can be counted out. And yes, I think he has a very legitimate chance at this point of becoming the Democratic presidential nominee.
Okay. I love talking to you, and I appreciate the straightforwardness and the candor. I wish we got it from every political person I speak to on JBS. Good for you. And I have not taken any position myself. I'm not going to take any position myself on any candidate. What I've tried to be here on JBS is as fair to all of them, Alan. I, at the same time, believe there is a political elite and a political system which already has decided that Hillary Clinton is going to be the nominee, so that, having nothing to do with my personal preference, I will be shocked, absolutely shocked, if Bernie Sanders comes anywhere near the Democratic nomination for president. And I will be watching, and one day I may call you and say, Alan, you were absolutely correct. I do take issue with one thing you said, and I believe I see this all the time in the American media, on American television. And for you to use the word high with Bernie Sanders and dark for Donald Trump, those are ad hominem comments which I believe are not worthy of any serious journalist. You may not like what Donald Trump says, but there are many Americans who are turned on and don't feel or believe anything they're doing or saying is dark. And one of the things I believe is critical on the American scene is that those kind of characterizations are no longer part of journalistic commentary. So I really, for you to say that Donald Trump is dark, Donald Trump simply has his perspective. And
I didn't say Donald Trump is dark. I said
you used the dark side. You said Donald Trump represents the dark side, and that Bernie Sanders is on the high side.
No. What I said was that Donald Trump's appeal is reaching a dark
Why?
underbelly.
Why is that? Why do you want to? But why is
public.
it? You mean that if somebody who's attracted to Donald Trump it's their dark side that attracts them to Donald Trump? Why would you say that, Alan?
I think that an appeal to nativist beliefs that are critical of minorities and others, and that are feeling that their America is being stolen by the other, and Donald Trump has worked very hard to create a sense of us and the other, that is in fact a dark and unflattering side to the American psyche. Look, Mark, America once had a very popular political party called the Know Nothings. And this is a strain in American politics, American history, unfortunately, that has never really gone away. The John Birch Society, pick an era, and I can give you a name of an organization or a community or a section of America, the KKK. Pick one, I don't know, where there has been what I think is fair. I'm not saying this as a personal critique of individuals, but that there is a dark side to the American psyche that Donald Trump has tapped into. In fact, one political journalist, I don't remember who, put it this way: when the reason for Donald Trump's appeal has been that the other Republican Party candidates, people wanting to run for president, are saying, I understand your anger. And Donald Trump says, I'm angry. And I think that in one sentence encapsulates the difference between Donald Trump and the other Republican candidates. And as for Bernie Sanders, when I say Bernie Sanders is appealing to the hopeful aspirations of people who believe in fairness and fair play and a level playing field and honesty and a lack of artifice and not being under the control of people who have more money than who feel that they're entitled to have power and authority because of their wealth and their positions. I think that's a very similar appeal to Trump.
Okay,
But Bernie's
so
saying
far,
we could be better, and Donald Trump is saying we're worse.
okay, so far, here's what I've heard you say. You're going to compare Donald Trump to John Birch and KKK, that ultimately that Donald Trump is not in favor of fair play or honesty. I think you have it very much wrong. And I'll tell you why I think Donald Trump has tapped into something very important in American politics. It's not that every Republican now says, I'm angry too. The notion that only Donald Trump is angry, that's silly. Every single candidate right now is saying they're angry, Alan. The one difference is that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump share something in common. They both seem to be anti-establishment. And at the moment, what Americans really hate is the entire system. They don't believe anybody. They don't believe any typical, traditional politician, whether it's Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side or whether it's the whole list on the Republican side. And what you have here is, I'm sorry, Alan, good people who believe in fair play, who believe in honesty, who are still committed to a notion that America welcomes immigrants, although they probably would say in a legal fashion, and that the characterization that somehow, if you like Donald Trump, it's because he's appealing to your dark side, is something we do here all the time. And this is the first opportunity I've had to talk to somebody who said it out loud, and it gives me a chance to say what I believe is true, that it is a terrible mischaracterization, and that ultimately, Donald Trump on the Republican side and Bernie Sanders on the Democrat side are either going to stand or fall on whether most people do or do not believe they represent the best chance for America. I don't believe Bernie Sanders is going to be the Democratic nominee. It would be very surprising to me if Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee. I believe that ultimately you're going to get two very much establishment candidates, and that the American people are going to go to the polls and vote for the one they think is the least problematic, the least bad. And that's a problem we've had for now cycle after cycle after cycle. And I don't think the American politicians, or for that matter, journalists who have a bias here, and the bias is Trump is bad and Sanders is good, that ultimately the media doesn't understand it either, because the media is hated and mistrusted as much as the traditional politicians are. So that's my position. You have a chance now to respond.
Well, I think that you said something that I absolutely agree with, is that there is a strong strain of anti-establishment belief in the United States. And frankly, we see it here in Israel too, right? We have very little faith in our current political leaders and our political system, and we seem to lack the ability to bring out someone who represents our hopes and our aspirations, but is more able to appeal to our fears and our prejudices. And then, frankly, yes, in our dark side too. So there is a strong anti-establishment strain underway now, and that is absolutely being demonstrated by the rise of Sanders and Trump. And I agree with you. So we're absolutely in agreement. And as a result, I think that it's certainly possible that the establishment will once again trump, as it were, and triumph in this election, and that Hillary Clinton and either Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio or some John Kasich or some relatively mainstream Republican will in fact be the nominees. That's certainly the conventional wisdom, and that's certainly the likelihood. But I think that one thing I think we can say that this year is that all bets are off, that every single time somebody has tried to advance a new conventional wisdom, that new conventional wisdom has been proven to be inaccurate and has been proven wrong. And so that's why I'm not saying Bernie will be the nominee. I'm not in the business of political prognostication. I'll leave that to the Nate Silvers and and Ezra Kleins of the world. But I do believe that that this anti-establishment strain may have broken through to some tipping point. There may be a tipping point this year. It's pretty ironic that a guy who 6 months ago was considered by the mainstream media a whack job is now the obvious front runner, at least in New Hampshire. And it's not a big deal if he wins. Well, I think if you wrote that story today and sent it back in time to a reporter in mid-2015, he'd think you had made it up. So I don't know if the American populace, the American mainstream middle-of-the-road consensus has completely broken down. But it does seem that this year they're inching closer toward that. And whether, if you want to say Bernie on the extreme left and Cruz, or Donald Trump on something that you might call a more extreme right, and then Michael Bloomberg tries to come in to fill that emptiness in the middle, maybe that will again change things and delay this political upheaval that's happening in America, or maybe not. But I think it's certainly possible the American political system is at a tipping point.
Alan, I had a million other questions to ask you, and I never got to them because it is so much fun to talk to you. I hope you'll let me call you again, and we'll continue the conversation. As I said, you're doing fabulous work, and I love to think through the process with you, and I'm most appreciative that you give us this time here on JBS.
Mark, it's always my pleasure, and win, lose, or draw, I'm happy to talk to you again.
Thank you so very, very much. The thoughts of Alan Abbey, the Media and Internet Director for the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, who before making Aliyah worked as a political reporter here in America. As always, my thanks to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, JBS's Associate Director, Dara Golub, and to the producer of this edition of JBS's Election 2016, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.